Good evening. Welcome back to the Liquid Antiquarian. We are back. Well, I say we, actually, Dave is not with us tonight. He is stuck in Montilla, Jerez, up to his oxters in PX, was as he described it, drinking Fino, another nice sherry over there. So let's not feel too sorry for him, but don't worry. We've not fallen out. The dynamic Dusty duo will be back on Monday when we continue this little series, digesting, analysing, reacting to this incredible book. I think the whiskey community is still digesting it a little bit, trying to work out its significance. We all know it is very, very big and very, very exciting. So it is, if you just stumbled across this episode and not quite sure what I'm talking about. So this is the Distilleries of Great Britain and Ireland, a journey through the Heartlands of Whisky 1922 to 1929, published by the blender and independent bottler James Eadie Limited, a great supplier of ours and a blender and independent bottler of great skill, who I admire enormously. I admire them even more now because they have made this happen. What is it? So it is a series of articles that were published in the Wine and Spirit Trade Record in the 20s. And it was a set of distillery visits, serialized, as I say, with photographs, describing 124 different distilleries, a few gin distilleries, a few Irish distilleries in there, but mostly Scotch single malt whiskey distilleries. And it represents this complete, well, not complete, but amazing set of descriptions and photographs of these distilleries. Many of them lost, many of them demolished a long time ago. And even the ones that are in existence today, they are greatly changed. So, I mean, it's hard to describe the significance of it. As I say, we're all still taking this in. In a previous life, I did a degree in archaeology and a little bit of professional archaeological work. It feels to me, especially with these photographs, that this is, well, archaeologists, they root around looking for bones and shadows in the ground and lines of rocks and things like this. We've not just found the bones here. It's like when they cut Otzi the Iceman out of the glacier from between I think it was Italy and Austria, the border. We don't just get the bones. With these photographs, we get to see the skin, the hair, and the guts of these distilleries. It really is an amazing contribution to whiskey culture, to the whiskey community, and it's a huge achievement by Leon, who you'll meet very soon, a huge contribution to our understanding of 20th century whiskey. And I'm sure it is a book that will be read and referred to for many years to come. So I'll get that big compliment out of the way for Leon, because he doesn't like to be the centre of attention. He's very, very modest. I think I can see him blushing backstage. So while we let that blush depart, I was going to just give a little bit of context to the articles. Many of you might have already bought this book and enjoyed it over the last week or so. It was released exactly a week today, and it's doing very, very well. But it's a series of articles, and they're not in isolation. I thought it was worth actually talking a little bit, 5-10 minutes maybe, just about the publication itself. And Leon has obviously airlifted these articles out of the magazine and photographs and had them digitized with the help of the British Library digitization team, but they don't exist in isolation. So what is the magazine? Who's reading it? Who's advertising in it? Let's just have a little look and explore that. So first of all, this is the month of April 1924. Yes, published in April 1924. And I've got some images of advertisers and a few articles and things like that, which I would like to show you. So this is the magazine here. You can see a number of adverts on the front there: Courvoisier, Port, Mercier, Champagne, Martell, even some olive oil. That's actually quite unusual. And here is one of the articles in situ, if you will. So this is the Speyburn distillery visit. And so, as I say, it's alongside other drinks, in this case, port, brandy, Hutchison and Co. shippers. Here is the other article that was in this monthly edition. That's Scotia, just tucked off to the left, and you can see Burgundy, Pierre Ponel, bottled wines, considerable stock in London. But not just alcohol. In the middle there, we've got Speeds, Belle of the Orient, Egyptian cigarettes, Bowles Kummel on the right there, and Warwick's Advocat, a brand that still exists and sits languishing at the back of many cocktail bars. I noticed there also it was the first Advocat to be sold in fluid form from the year 1912. I didn't realise you could get solid Advocat. I don't know how you have solid Advocat. On toast, on a crumpet, maybe. Rum. Here we have some Jamaican rum listed with the various crops and the various marks. Rum geeks will appreciate that. That's Mars and Sun. And then over on the left, you've got Railway Leaky Co. rums. And you can see Highland Park sitting there just in the middle, alongside other things, alongside Australian wines and Algerian wines. So I know we're maybe not all whiskey geeks here, but there'll be a lot of focus on the whiskey elements here, but it's just one drink among many in this magazine. And there's some softer content as well, educational pieces. So this is one page here which lists wooden wine vessels. It's probably the longest historical article on various different types of cups and drinking vessels I've ever seen. It stretched for 15, 20 pages, I think, with lots and lots of images of different drinking cups, if you're into that kind of thing. Which seemed to be purely educational as well. And I think there's elements of the articles that are educational as much as anything, rather than trying to sell anything. Then this one even had how it's talking to the trade. This presumably is a celebrity of the trade, Mr. R. Kenneth Koch of Koch, Russell and Co. And this is actually in fact, I've got it here, I guess. Yeah. So this is actually a pull-out supplement poster of Mr. R. Kenneth Koch to stick on your wall. And he's just a prominent trader. So it is a trade publication. And with that comes advertisements for all the various things you might need. Capsules, bottles, straw envelopes, corks and sundries, cooperage. The list, I could have shown many adverts there. Gauges, for example. All sorts, as well as all the various different brokers, etc. And then what about the whiskey adverts? Because there's some doozies in here. Let's start with the big boy, the Distillers Company Limited. On the left there, this is two separate pages. You've got some big bruising grain distilleries. Of course, the Distillers Company made a lot of grain whiskey and pushed the concept of grain whiskey pretty hard, and they wanted blends over malts. I think that's pretty uncontroversial to say, although Knockdo is sitting there as a malt, Scotch malt whiskey distillery. But then also on the right-hand side, the only distillery in Glenlivet, the Glenlivet Distillery, also from the Distillers Company Limited, 12 Torpican Street, Edinburgh. The only distillery in Glenlivet. I'm pretty certain we'll see there's a few other people claiming to be Glenlivet in a sec. Irish whiskey as well. What else do we have? We have Grant's Stand Fast and Dear Ken John Haig. But you'll notice quite small, admittedly, down there, sole proprietors of the Glenfiddich and Balvenie Glenlivet distilleries. So within these adverts, there's interesting relationships between blended whiskey, single malt whiskey, being sold, so malt whiskey being sold as an ingredient, but yet it was also drunk as a self whiskey or single malt. Here's another example. Buchanan Scotch whiskies, Black and White and Royal Household, but then they list their distilleries, Bankia and Glentocher's Glenlivet distillery. they would be asked to stop using that later in the century, the Glenlivet suffix. Highland Queen, I've blown up, that's the same, I've just basically blown up that detail. Old whisky is becoming scarcer today, but owing to the something policy of this house, far-sighted policy of this house, in accumulating large stocks of old whisky, Highland Queen always maintains its high standard of quality. Their distilleries are Glenmorangie Distillery and Glenlivet Distillery. Old whisky becoming scarce, probably because we are not, the First World War is not that long ago. And so aged stocks are potentially pretty rare. I've shown, yes, the Rowett Leakey Rum & Co. on the right, Rum's one with Highland Park in the middle, but then on the right, then we've got another merchant trader with Tierninich Distillery, Glenlossie, Glenlivet Distillery, but again, mixed in with other drinks and with equal or even less prominence with other drinks, Chartreuse, Louis Roederer, Thomas Hein Cognac, etc. And to show this relationship between single malt as its own thing, as its own drink, but then also as an ingredient, this Highland Park advert is a lovely example of that. If you're going to build a great house, be sure your foundation is good. On a poor foundation, you can build nothing of value. The foundation of a fine blend of Scotch whisky must be North Country malt. There are many good North Country whiskies, but it will be difficult to find one that will make a surer foundation than Highland Park. For sample of new make, apply to distillers. And then, let's just end with the lovely adverts like this. Lefroy Distillery, presumably purchased as an ingredient, but also in its own right and drunk in its own right. Glendronach Distillery, there you go, there's Cock, Russell and Co. That lovely illustration of Glendronach. And Ardbeg, McDougall and Co. Limited. So there's an interesting mix of how whisky is presented depending on the audience. And I must say, it's a really good publication as well. There's lots to enjoy in there and many, many, many adverts, hundreds and hundreds of adverts. But then, of course, we don't have the internet. And if you are a wine merchant or grocer or small blender or someone who works within the industry, a publican perhaps, then this is the place you would find the relevant information you need to start or build or change your business. I see loads of comments flying in. Thank you. That's great to know you didn't forget about us and you wanted to watch a bit more Liquid Antiquarian. We really appreciate it. Once we get talking to Leon a little bit more, I might be able to keep an eye on those comments, bring some up on screen, maybe even ask some questions directly of Leon, pick out a few of the things. We can see what you're typing on YouTube and Facebook. So I'll bring in Leon, and I'm not sure if I said at the beginning of the show, but we'll also have Tom Bruce-Gardyne, spirits writer, wine writer, who was one of the very first people to find out about the entirety of this project and had the honour of writing the introduction, and an excellent introduction it is too. So let's bring in the hero of the hour. Hi, Leon.
Hi, Arthur. How are you doing?
Yes, I'm good. So congratulations again. So glad you've managed to get this over the line. You kindly shared details of this about 5 years ago, I think it was. And since then, I've been this cheerleader, but a slightly aggressive cheerleader. Whenever I saw you saying, get the book done, and at times seething with jealousy that you had found it, because Dave and I were busy kind of panning for little flecks of gold in these kind of backwaters of history, and meanwhile you were hacking off whole nuggets of gold from this mine you had found. But the jealousy is all past now, and I'm just so pleased you brought this to the world.
No, absolutely. And Arthur, I have to be honest as well. I am extremely grateful to you and some of the other aggressive cheerleaders who were encouraging us to publish this for years and years. I think I told you at some point around 2018, I realized that in addition to the small voice in the back of my mind saying, I think this could be interesting, maybe we should publish it, a second voice in the form of Arthur Motley also appeared back there and was, chipping away, telling me to publish it. And it's very, very nice that we've been able to come full circle a few years later and finally let the cat out of the bag and get to present it and talk it through with you. So yeah, very, very happy to be here.
It's a good news story. It's a really, really good news story for the whisky community. So I'm really interested in the process of discovery. You were, and we are drinking a bit of it, you were researching Trademark X, I believe, the blend that was resurrected by your boss, Rupert Patrick. You found something in the British Library. How did that start? Which article did you find first? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking me to sort of delve back into the mists of time, a simpler time of 2015, where actually we just begun to resurrect the James Eadie business. So James Eadie, for those of you watching who don't know, founded in 1854, brewing company as well as a blending company, and was making a blended whiskey, which amongst other people, Alfred Barnard was actually one to try and sample and write about it and also meet James Eadie. And he went there ostensibly to talk about beer in the 4-volume history of the breweries of the United Kingdom. But he ended up basically sitting down in an armchair and sharing a dram with James Eadie and talking about this fantastic blended whiskey, which had been handed down to him by his father and which he was trying and thoroughly enjoying. And also, as an aside, he said that James Eadie was a thoroughly nice chap as well, which was an added bonus. So we had these sort of tantalizing nuggets of information that were out there. But as I'm sure you've come across with the Liquid Antiquarian as well, you find a small piece of information and it's quite captivating, and then it's a dead end and you really don't know what to find. So we basically decided at that point, reviving the James Eadie business, we should revive the blended whiskey that he was making and his descendants were making up until the 1940s. We had one of the last bottles remaining. We tried that along with Tom, actually, and Dave. And there's a video on YouTube if anyone wants to see us drinking it in real time. And we were looking for kind of more information about what was in this lovely whiskey. And so we went to lots of different archives and libraries and so on and so forth. And in the National Brewery Centre in Burton, we found his ledgers, and that led us on to reviving the whiskey itself of Trademark X. But as part of the wider process, what we also did is we went to the British Library, amongst other places, and did the traditional thing of try to get our hands on as many copies of anything from that period as possible to try and illuminate the history of James Eadie. And we came across this phenomenal resource called the Wine and Spirit Trade Record. So the Wine and Spirit Trade Record began in 1874, continued for almost 100 years, almost made it 100 years. It made it to 1971, where it changed ownership and it changed the kind of profile, and it became more of a kind of glossy wine and spirit magazine. I think it was called Wine and Spirit International. But basically, for 100 years, it was giving, as you showed so kind of brilliantly just before, such an incredible breadth and overview of everything that was happening in the wine and spirit business. Not just whiskey, lots of other things. Not a huge amount on beer, unfortunately, which is problematic for James Eadie, although we did find some stuff in there. But very, very good specifically on whiskey. Now, the British Library has everything from 1898 up until, well, with some gaps up until actually 1971. So that was great. So, as you do when you're presented with a huge amount of information, you just sort of dive in there and see what you can find. And we found quite a lot of stuff. we found quite a lot of stuff, and probably have digested about 2 or 3% of what's in there. As you showed, there's just a huge amount of stuff from one volume, from 1 month, let alone for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years that we were looking at. But in addition to this James Eadie stuff, we found some articles. And, you know, initially when I was having a look at these, you know, thought, okay, this is interesting. We saw a couple. I can't remember which ones we saw in first. I think actually there were some of the ones in the middle, 1926, 1927. I vaguely remember maybe Thomas Street, the Irish one, being one of the first ones. But it was very, very hard to sort of digest and take in what was there because there were so many things. And it was really only, you know, in 2016 when we sort of sat down and looked at it and we realized that, you know, there wasn't just a sort of disparate group of articles, but it was actually a full series. And you know, maybe this doesn't reflect very well on me given that each one was numbered all the way through. But as you and other people that have come across this book have probably experienced, it's quite overwhelming at first. And so it sort of dawned on us that that this was a big full series, which had actually been undertaken over a period of 7 years, basically spanning the whole of the 1920s. The 1920s, you know, is as a decade for Scotch whisky was pretty turbulent. Frankly, as a decade for the world was also quite turbulent. So, you know, there was a lot of rich material going on there. But I'll be totally honest with you, Arthur. My initial assumption was that this must be in print, and I must be a fool for not knowing that. Because there, you know, there was just so many pictures. I mean, you know, very similar. I suppose the only comparable thing that I could think of at the time was Alfred Barnard, but you know, with a few photographs. So I reached out to a few people at the time. I knew that one of the, well, it dawned on me actually that one of the articles had been published, which was the Highland Park one, which was actually the article that the advert that you just put up there, the Good Foundation one. They paired that advert with the distillery profile, turned it into a pamphlet, and some years later that was reproduced by Highland Park and Ian Buxton. So that was the only one that I was aware of. I contacted quite a number of people just saying, you know, I've come across this series of articles. Are you aware of whether, you know, of this and whether it's still in print? And universally, no, basically. So then we were sort of...
It's a strange feeling that I've had that a couple of times where you think you're wrong, and then you realise that no one has written about this, and you do feel like a fool for not having read this important thing you found. I mean, it's the 1823 Act for me. I just assumed everyone else had read it, and then I asked the people I knew who should have read it, and they all said, "No, why would I read that?"
Exactly, yeah. It's a really very, very odd experience actually, and sort of, and so we then ended up having quite a nice problem to have, but a problem nonetheless, which was basically that we'd literally just started off an independent bottling company. We were in the process of trying to revive, you know, a lost blend, and then also potentially we were looking at you know, publishing a book as well. And it is quite a hard package to be able to explain to people what you actually do. So we decided to park it for the time being and focus on the bottling and the blending and so on and so forth, which was the right decision to do. But then explored various avenues. I mean, the you know, looking at the ways to do it and so on. And we had no experience ever publishing a book. That presents its own challenges. We are a very small company of 3 people. There's Rupert, the founder, who's the great-great-grandson of James Eadie. There's myself, and there's Hugh Barron, who manages our sales. And so between the 3 of us, we do everything together. You know, we select all the casks together. We decide on the products together. I mean, every single thing. A very, very small team, limited resources. And so the prospect of, you know, publishing a 3-kilo book with a, you know, full-on digitization process happening with the British Library and so on was at the beginning quite a daunting task. But after speaking to several people over the years, you, as you said, probably the most aggressive and forthright cheerleader of them all, we decided that we really ought to do this. And so that decision was probably reached in summer of 1920, no, not that far away. 2020. But then obviously that was in COVID. Digitalization process was then held up by that design process. These things, everything that seems like it should be a very quick thing, is certainly not doing it correctly. And for us, it was a completely new challenge. It was something that we had really never done. And actually, in that, the best thing that happened for the whole project is we were able to rely on people that were incredibly good at what they do, far more capable of what they do than I am at whatever it is that I do. And so, we had James Hutchison, Jim, who designed the book, who has done many books, and focused on all the right things to make this as accurate and close to the original publication, which is what we really wanted. We wanted to give people that feeling of discovering the book and being drawn in to this world of the 1920s, to, as the subtitle sort of puts it, to go through this journey through the heartlands of whiskey. That feeling, the same feeling that you probably had when you flicked open the Wine Spirit trade record and you're seeing the typeface, the images, the layout, all of that. That was really critical. I mean, the cover, the designing of the cover was, we went to various rare book shows to see what books from the 1920s, how they were designed. I mean, the cover is partially based on a 1920s first edition of Winnie the Pooh, actually, which had a green cover with just a singular gold Winnie the Pooh holding a balloon. So, it was trying to get that kind of balance between the, authenticity to the past without going, full mock Tudor or so. And Jim did a wonderful job, laying out the book, getting the typeface. I mean, the typeface is basically, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between this and what you have in the original publication. Caroline, who managed the print run, did an absolutely wonderful job of managing that, and what, as anyone who's worked in production in the last couple of years knows, has been a very challenging period to get anything made.
And I think it's worth saying as well, it nearly didn't happen on a number of occasions over the last years. And I once bumped into a publisher who turned down Harry Potter and met them at a cocktail party. And I'm not going to shame the people who decided this one. I don't know some of them, but one publisher said it didn't have commercial legs, effectively. So
more than one,
yeah, more than one. Well, there you go. So it's great to see it, the reception that has been so positive among our customers. Shall we start looking at a few images?
Absolutely.
Because the star of the show is very much the images, as well as some great nuggets in the words as well. So I suppose we start with maybe Glen Kinchy, and this I think was one of the articles that really struck you early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so you asked the question a bit earlier about which article I remember seeing first, and as I said, it was very hard to remember exactly what it is because it was so much to take in. But just flicking through the book again, and I think so. We typed the whole thing out. So the act of typing it out was a very good way of actually discovering A, what was in the book, and B, whether the book was interesting. If I got bored of typing it at some point, then I decided that we wouldn't print it. And so doing that in chronological succession and seeing the Glen Kinchy article, and the Glen Kinchy article it just sets the scene so brilliantly. There's this quote which I taken, which is just the first paragraph, and I won't read the whole thing because it's quite a long paragraph, but it starts with, although lowland malts are perhaps the least picturesque of the four categories of Scotch malt whisky, they constitute a highly appreciated ingredient of many well-known blends. Indeed, there are probably few blends in which they are not represented to a greater or lesser extent and the confidence with which they are regarded by blenders is evidenced by the fact that an unusually large proportion of the total output of the round dozen or so distilleries in the lowlands is regularly bonded by bulk brokers year after year and rarely figures in brokers' lists or auctioneers' catalogues. For many years, quite a substantial trade was done in the straight product of one or other of the lowland distilleries. But as in the case of other categories, such preference tended to disappear before the irresistible march of the all-conquering blend. So this is the first paragraph of the whole series, and what you get in that paragraph alone, they're talking about the different whiskey producing regions of Scotland and the noted different characteristics that they have at the time, the importance of lowland whiskies to blends, the various ways in which the trade was working in terms of acquiring stock, trading stock, and so on, and the changing relationship between single malts and blends. And that's just the first paragraph. Within the next few pages, it goes on to talk about the sources of barley and water, where they're getting them from, the full process of malting, mashing, fermentation, distilling, the maximum capacity that the distillery has, and then also the actual annual output, the distilling season that most malt whiskey distilleries are working on at the time, the on-site premises that they have for staff. I think they describe it at one point as a miniature garden city. You have very specific things to that moment in time as well. You have the transition occurring from horsepower to lorries, both of which are still in use. You have the fact that the stables were recently burnt down, as were the maltings, and so have been rebuilt. And then finally, it ends with the names of the major employees working at the distillery and also their past history, where they'd worked before, and so on and so forth. And you get, at the same time, you get these lovely images of, the gate going into Glenkinchie Distillery. You have some of those lovely horses and carts in the background. You have the stills there, which I think Jim said that's a example of 1920s photoshopping. Probably it's a little bit touched up with a paintbrush just to make some of the things a bit clearer. And you have these lovely steam engines and so on. And what's quite nice about that as well is that you're capturing a moment in time where you're having this transition from the world of Alfred Barnard, the world of horsepower, the world of quite heavy duty labor, and so on and so forth, and moving into a much more modern world, a world of steam mills, of steam engines, of labor-saving devices, and a self-conscious awareness of both of these things being there at the same time. And if you fast forward 100 years, then when people talk about malt whiskey, then that is the same balance between the past and the present, and arguably the future that you have in distilleries. The romantic, rustic spirit of Scotch whiskey, powered by incredibly high-tech engines.
There's a pride in modernity in the way so many of these distilleries are described. But yet there are also some ways that seem incredibly old-fashioned to us and that reach back right into the 19th century. So you've actually got both side by side. And if you could choose an era to have 650 photographs from distilleries, the 20s is a pretty great one in terms of what we're missing. Although there have already been a couple of comments, come on, do one on the 50s now. I mean, I'm sure we will if we can. I'm sure that
if we find that time machine, absolutely. Love to do something like that.
Among so there's this pride in modernity, a lot of talk of the power of their engine rooms, but yes, also this romanticism for the past. But there are also some pretty big distilleries there as well. So here we've got an image of Caledonian, North British, and I think the way the grain whiskey is described is really striking.
Yeah, I mean so on the one hand, I mean they talk about with that power and modernity and so on. I mean they mentioned that the North British was one of the first buildings in Edinburgh to have electric lighting. So this is a industry and buildings within an industry that's really at the cutting edge of society. in Scotland, and not just in the more remote places, but actually in Edinburgh itself, right in the heart of the city. And so that's quite striking. Another thing that's quite striking about both of these two is just, like you said, the sheer scale of the distilleries. They mention the range of facilities which are on site. You have plasterers' shops, you have cooperages, of course, you have fitters' shops, you have these gargantuan warehouses. I think they use the words gargantuan and gigantic. I mean, you get the sense of whoever's visiting these distilleries being, quite overwhelmed at the scale of what they're seeing. They talk about employing hundreds of people in the distilleries, and you really do get that sense. And later on, when you see some of the Irish distilleries as well, you see that as well. The other thing, just quickly, which is quite fascinating about these two distilleries, is they both mentioned that grain whiskies at the time were made of malted barley, maize, rye, and oats. And they actually give the mash bill for North British at the time, which is mashing temperature is 140 degrees, and the composition of the mash is maize 73%, malt 25%, oats 2%. Now, I'm sure that means more to people working in distilleries than it necessarily means to me, but even from a cursory glance, that seemed quite striking and quite different to what we're getting nowadays.
Oats for filtration, apparently.
Yeah.
But again, very specific and considered, it would seem. They had access to all these cereals. They chose that particular mash bill. So I noticed one comment here from where's he gone? Colin Mayers. He's watched Liquid Antiquarian before. Great discussion, very insightful. I'll watch the remaining hours on catch up. Yeah, I hope you won't take more hours. We'll try and batter through these, but there is so much. This is just a little overview. That's why we've tried to break it up into a few little different discussions with different specialisms, starting with the historians on Monday. Is it Monday or Tuesday? Monday. And then the distillers next week as well. So we can talk a little bit more about the production and the equipment with Alan Winchester, formerly of Glenlivet, and Robert Fleming of Tomatau and Glencairn and things like that. But yeah, the grain distilleries are amazing, absolutely amazing. And then I think this is another early one that's the image on the right, I think, has been seen before, hasn't it? This laboratory.
I'm not sure.
Well, I've seen an image of the laboratory somewhere, and this is the laboratory that Masataka Takatsuru would have worked at.
Yes, and what's again quite interesting about that, and I would imagine, when I showed this to Nick Morgan a few months ago, that this was the image that he really focused on and was really sort of fascinated with, and I would imagine that he will speak more on this particular image when he is on the show next week, and certainly will give you much more information than I'm able to do so. But I mean, again, one of the things that really jumped out to me reading this for the first time is within this lab, they say, to facilitate these tests, the whole process of distilling is carried on in a miniature distillery, which has been cleverly fitted up in the laboratory. This is a fascinating little apparatus, including a Lilliputian malt mill modeled precisely on the lines of the large machine in the malt house. So within this lab, they had effectively built a tiny version of the distillery, apparently, if only there was a photo of that, which they were then using to do scientific tests in there. And that, for me, certainly, I can't claim to be massively knowledgeable, certainly nowhere in the realm of, the people that will be subsequently coming onto the show. But this really challenged my notion of what Campbelltown whiskey was, And they talk about Hazelburn is one of the many in Campbelltown that have recently come under new management with exceedingly beneficial results. Hazelburn has undergone changes which may legitimately be described as revolutionary. charging the local industry with new life, and so on and so forth. So you get this image of a, the former whisky capital of Scotland, where everyone assumes that because it was about to, most of the distilleries were about to shut a few years after these distillery articles were written. So this is a industry on the down and out, in a death spiral. It's old-fashioned, nothing's going right, it's about to disappear. And then you have someone visiting it and saying, well, wait a second, what these guys are doing is absolutely revolutionary. We're about to see the second coming. Within a few years, most of the distilleries are closed.
So we've gone from high 20s of the headcount of distilleries in Campbelltown to 2, effectively. 3, exactly. The third that limps on. And there is this crash. But because it happens, it's inevitable. Because it happened, there's an assumption that it's inevitable. But even this late on in the 20s, they are investing in the future. They are becoming modern. Springbank is sparklingly clean and modern, which is amusing to the modern Springbank fan, who of course thinks of it as this cobwebby old hub of tradition. But they have a very different view of it in this book or in this series of articles. But there are some much stronger headwinds around the corner.
Absolutely.
And of course, we don't just visit Scotland. We visit gin distilleries in England, but I don't think we're going to cover those today. Fascinating though they are. I think Joanne McKirker mentioned how fascinating they are. And they are great gin distilleries. It was funny at Whisky Fringe. There were lots of people presented with all these whiskey distilleries, and they were like, gin, nah. They didn't for it. But they are great, and there's some crazy stills. But we also visit Ireland.
Yeah.
So beautiful team photo. I mean, that shows the big distillery, St John's Lane, but there's a lot of people there.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I mean, one of the, I suppose that actually the area that really sort of fascinated me the most when I was looking through these, and I think I'm right in saying that Tom is going to probably say the same, is the Irish distilleries, because what's very interesting about the articles is just as much what's not written as what is. So, for example, the John's Lane article was written in 1923, or was published in November 1923. Now, why is it not published sooner than that? Because there's been a civil war going on. But there is no reference to that at all. There's no reference to the fact that Ireland is no longer part of the United Kingdom, that it's its own separate country at this point. And actually, if you contrast that with what the record is talking about as a journal, it's completely different. They are constantly very up to date about what's happening in Ireland, what's happening in the politics of Ireland, the treatment of the distillers by the new Free State, the relationship going on there, the changes, the introduction of trade barriers between Britain and Ireland, or potential erection of trade barriers and plus de change, and there's so much there which it's left unsaid in the articles, and so you kind of get this impression of this huge industry in Ireland, which fundamentally things have changed since Barnard, but the fundamental structure of the Irish whiskey industry, that they view as, if you had it without that context, it would be sort of the same world, and yet it's completely different. But the Irish distilleries.
This edition mentions what they're doing about duty with the Free State and what the situation is with duty, but no, nothing else.
Yeah,
this is how it affects tax.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, and but the Irish distilleries are just absolutely huge. And I was in Dublin last month, and I wanted to see where some of the distilleries, what's left of them, basically. And
I took the liberty. You WhatsApped them to me, and I took the liberty of doing a bit of then and now for you there.
Yeah, so that has not changed very much. I mean, the plaque above the door has changed. That's now the National College of Art and Design. But that is pretty much the only thing that remains the same. The stills are still there, and actually steam engine, which, as far as I'm aware, isn't actually photographed in the book, unfortunately, but is mentioned. The steam engine is still in the building, but that's all that remains. But that distillery, John's Lane, was producing 1 million proof gallons per annum, which, for context, is, I think, 4 times the amount that the largest malt whiskey distillery in Scotland was producing, and only, I think, probably a third of what the grain distilleries were producing. Absolutely huge. And as anyone who's been to Dublin knows, right in the centre of the city, and you go maybe 500 meters further down the road, and then you get to Thomas Street. Thomas Street, they don't talk about the production capacities in this book, but in a separate article, they talk about it in 1902, and Thomas Street was capable of producing 2 million proof gallons per annum. So, I mean, we're talking about distilleries on a completely different scale to what was in the Scotch whisky industry. We're talking about distilleries that are slap bang in the centre of the city, and huge, absolutely huge sites. I mean, each of these were between, I think, 6 and 20 acre sites. I mean, that's the equivalent of at least, Westminster Palace, for example, of each of those in the city centres, with hundreds of people employed, with like you showed with the employees at John's Lane, tons and tons of people.
You went with Westminster Palace as your comparison for the size of the Irish distilleries.
It's the only thing that I could find for 6 acre site. It's the one that sticks with me.
Okay.
So it's absolutely huge. I mean, for context, the Guinness brewery, St James's Brewery, is 50 acres. So you're talking, but that really, when you're walking around that, it feels like its own town. And so you're talking about sites which, at their maximum, were probably half the size of that, and there were several of them slap bang in the center, and they're amazing. And there's a photo which I don't think I just stumbled across again recently, and I'm not sure I mentioned it to you, but it's the photo of Kuebler Distillery, and it's the mash tun. And this is not one of the pot still distilleries. This is actually just a malt distillery. But I don't know where this is going to work. But if you see that, that's a man in one of the mash tuns. They're just absolutely massive. They're absolutely huge.
I'll tell you what would work better is if I prepped the slide already.
There we go.
If you told me what you were doing, I could have just called that straight up.
But the scale is just phenomenal.
And the engineering of that gearing, and just beautiful. It must have been noisy and just amazing places to be in. I mean, difficult and dangerous places to work at times as well, I would think. But there's a changing tone in the book, isn't there, as well? We talk about the headwinds, and I think, does the book end with Strathclyde Grain Distillery? Yeah,
it does. And the Strathclyde, so that's published, I think, almost to the day, 7 years later. And it's a very different world that it finds itself in. So it's October 1929. It's published 2 weeks before the Wall Street crash. And the optimism of the early 1920s is well and truly dead. And it talks about, basically says, words to the effect of, it is absolutely amazing that someone has decided to build a new distillery. It's completely remarkable, especially since so many of the old and well-established distilleries are now silent. Best of luck to them. So, really, you get the beginning of the 20s full of optimism, full of feeling that after the First World War, after Spanish flu, after, all of these disasters, that things are going to be, turning better. And then you get to the end of the 1920s, the realization that things are not turning better. Things are, probably going to take a much more serious turn. And yeah, really quite striking. But at the same time, what's also great about that article is that it gives you an insight into a brand new, as modern as you can get, distillery in the 1920s. Literally, built from scratch, everything in there completely modern, completely new. and it's a very, very detailed article with a lot of pictures. I think, I mean, off the top of my head, it's like 15 different pictures of that. So that's really kind of well catalogued of, you know, what exactly a modern, up-to-date distillery in the 20s looked like.
Right, let's bring Tom in, because I think he's got to shoot off at 9, and we've already burnt through 3/4 of an hour pretty quickly. So let's bring Tom in for a bit. We can come back to some of your favourite pictures again, Leon, in a short while. But good evening, Tom.
Hi, good evening. Good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for coming along. So you were one of the very first people to be have the details of this secret project shared, and to get the of it.
I mean, Leon sent me the original sort of copy about 7 or 8 years ago. So it's been sitting in my laptop ever since. And I think, like Leon, I didn't realize quite how significant this book was. I mean, it was, you know, it was only when you started delving into it, the nuggets of history, and it was, you know, a primary source of history. You know, it wasn't just repeating what had already been done. It was a completely fresh source of heritage history for the Scotch whisky industry at a really interesting time. I felt so yeah, it was great. And then Leon asked me to do the introduction, and it went back and forth quite a few times, but I think, you know, in the end we got, you know, a good intro to it. And then I came up with the idea of putting little sort of a footnote at the end, which we compiled at the end of the book, as to what happened to, you know, all the distilleries, you know, whatever happened to, you know, Glencool in Justin Hock on the South Esk, for example, you know, closed a year after the book, you know, after that magazine profile appeared. And the same with, you know, all those Campbelltown distilleries that, and as Leon was saying about, you know, the fact that the Irish distillers didn't, you know, there wasn't mention of partition. There wasn't mention that the Republic was a separate country or anything like that. The same with Campbelltown. There wasn't really, you know, reading those profiles, any sense that the whole thing was about to almost implode completely, leaving, you know, just one distillery left by the end of the 1920s.
Yeah, amazing. I think you've done a super job, not only with the introduction, but the end notes are really, really helpful as well. And there's some great little nuggets in there. Was that the one that shut with the dispute with the local tennis club over water, the water supply? I thought that was a particularly good little nugget.
Yeah. A lot of them got buried under, you know, turned into garages, buried under housing. You know, I think it's a lottery where once your distillery closed, you know, whether you were, you know, in the Highlands, no one was going to build over you, or you were in a town, and you were going to get redeveloped.
Yeah, there's a little chart that just shows the split of where the distilleries are and whether or not they are still in production today. That's quite helpful. But tell me about a couple of the distilleries that struck you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, exactly like Leon was saying. I mean, Glenkinchie's profile is fascinating, and you know, I like this little. I'll just read you a little bit. It said the houses are surrounded by smiling gardens and embowered in trees, giving the little village a singularly attractive appearance, which is materially enhanced by the velvety green turf of a well-kept bowling green. The company's care for the welfare of the workmen extends to the provision of a dairy. Milk, curiously enough, being a scarce commodity in the district. So, you know, you get a sense that they really care for the workers, and also how picturesque Glenkinchie was, which of course was one reason, well, the only real reason that it was picked to be on the classic malt plinth, and Rosebank, which should have been there, you know, wasn't. Because when the suit from Central Office turned up at Rosebank, you know, the canal was stagnant, and probably a few trolleys poking out of it And compared to the velvety turf of the Glenkinchie bowling green, there wasn't any competition. And Rosebank closed in 1993, and amazingly, thank goodness it's being resuscitated. And just a little story I was telling you about Arthur that I heard subsequently. This is from the 1950s, early 50s. That the locals used to swim in the canal when they were discharging hot water from the worm tubs, and it was a sort of little bit of heated water for them to swim in. And I met this guy, John Ferguson, who learnt to swim there when he was about 12. And the lock keeper would close the gates, and they, the word got round that the water was coming out, and then they'd jump. Which is kind of sweet, I thought.
Yeah, really sweet, really sweet. And you do get these changed worlds very much. It wasn't one you mentioned, but when you describe this kind of pastoral idyll, I mean, this just looks like a little country cottage, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This is Islay, but it's in Perth, isn't it? Islay, not on Islay. And just, what's that? A little greenhouse, is that off to the right there? On the right-hand side image, are they growing some vegetables there, possibly?
Yeah. Could
and
be.
Of course, yeah, and they're not expecting visitors. I mean, they sent some hack from the wine spirit trade record, but there's no visitor centres at this stage.
No.
That's for the workers. That's just to keep a nice place.
No, I know. I mean, there were a couple of others I was going to just sort of mention.
Sure.
Was one that struck me was Pulteney. I don't know if you've got a picture of Pulteney. I can't remember.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, well done. So Pulteney was, distilling in a dry town at the time, and in the book it says, it'd be interesting to have had Stevenson, as in Robert Louis Stevenson's, impressions of Wick under the dry regime, and doubtless he would have written a humorous, vivid, and caustic description of the absurdity of the picture of a sturdy Highland fisherman quenching their thirst with soft drinks. And and you behind the book, because I did read, Leon shared with me some of the articles from the magazine, and I was reading, and I'd just like to read you this little piece here. This is June 1921, and this was the Wine and Spirit trade record, saying, it was obvious to all people of moderate, not to say conservative opinion, that Sinn Féin, extreme socialism, Bolshevism, and anarchy have succeeded in fixing their vicious tentacles into the vitals of poor old Britain, still tortured on the rack of restrictions and virtual prohibition after 2.5 years of so-called peace. And, it was a real battle. It was a real existential fight. Prohibition was raging in America. That had come in, but it came, damn close to happening here. And Pulteney was, Wick was one of the towns that voted dry. And so you had this, in the records view, this absurdity of, distilling whiskey in a town that you weren't allowed to drink anything more than soft drinks.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. And you notice as well there, I had the fire engine as well, which we mentioned electrification before. And of course, that's important because the burning down of distilleries is mentioned on a number of occasions throughout the book, as it is through history. I mean, there were a huge fire risk already with the mills, but also if you needed flame of any type to light. So electrification was a great boon to them, I would think, for that reason also. I prepped up Macallan. We were talking about Macallan the other day, Tom.
Yes.
And just thinking about scale as well, and what the Stillman, this Macallan, would think of the modern Macallan.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Macallan back then, 3 stills, and 36 today. And
have you been to the new one?
yes, I have. And
I did a little then and now for that one as well. I mean, what would
yeah.
they make of it? And just a few guys wandering around operating all that, they would be terrified at the very concept of it.
I know. And one of the things that it's funny, the 1920s, they were still talking about bushels of malt, and bushel is a very, sort of medieval measurement of its volume, not weight. But you can work out, if you do the maths, and with bushels of malt and imperial gallons of proof gallons, so they're not, pure alcohol, they're about 50% alcohol, but you could kind of work out that they were getting at Macallan a yield of about, I think it was 340 litres of pure alcohol per tonne of grain. And, that would get you fired today as a distillery manager, because
140.
340, yeah. So you'd have to get a minimum of 410 today. Now, less. There would have been maybe less chemicals used, less yield. Maybe there was more flavour in that barley, some heritage variety they were using. Who knows? Maybe it was a better whiskey. Who knows?
Yeah, there's going to be a few different takes on that, and I've already. Part of the fascinating thing about this book is, and watching people react to it at Whisky Fringe was, especially with the exhibitors. You've got the new school guys like the Thompson brothers up at Dornoch, and some others who are building a small distillery based on heritage barley and low volume, or low yield, I should say, and they were looking for things about yeast. Yeah, other big distillers were interested in it for very, very different reasons. I think there'll be a lot of people projecting their view of what they want out of modern whiskey, desperately trying to prove their point from information in the book.
Sure. Well, I mean, and there's, pride in some of these distilleries. We get our malt, we get our barley from the local farms. They come, or we get it only from Forfarshire barley or whatever. And others are proudly proclaiming they get it from Australia or they get it from Denmark.
That's one of the examples where I think we have to take some of the answers with a pinch of salt. I think Dr. Nick is maybe going to talk about that a little bit. They can't all have been using the Scottish barley all the time, but that's one of the fascinating elements you've got to interpret. I'm aware that's 9 o'clock. You've got something delicious in the oven you need to get to.
I have. Can I just leave with one point here? And this is
stay as long as you like, as long as you can.
Well, I'll just tell you about. This is from Lefroy, and I know we didn't have time to get a picture of Lefroy, but I'll just read you this little passage from the book, and it says, "The dreaded gaugers or excisemen, encouraged by the authorities, redoubled their efforts to suppress smuggling about this period, and the ownership of a wee small still gradually became a dangerous and unprofitable hobby. A vivid idea of the popular attitude towards the revenue officials during this time of repression is obtained from the story of the visitor to Islay, who asked a villager how many gorges were there in the neighbourhood. The Highlander lit his pipe reflectively and replied, "Aye, we had one here last week, but we drowned it." And, there's so much humour in the tales of the gorges. I mean, the word smuggling comes up 76 times in all these profiles. And yet, as Leon was saying to me, in the magazine at the time, they were casting outrageous, criminal activity of illicit stills. And yet there was this romanticized reflection that shared with Alfred Barnard about the smuggling, the heroic Highlander, the noble savage with his still.
There's a real, the expression I've used, the modern expression is cognitive dissonance, isn't it? That they have for revering the days of smuggling and also celebrating the capture of the people who are avoiding paying tax. But the source of it must come that they hate how much tax is on whiskey, as people do now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the tales of smuggling and how that contrasted to their actual take on illicit distillation in the present day, in the 1920s. It reminded me of visiting Niagara Falls, where there's a museum to all the daredevils who've gone over the falls in barrels and in drums and what have you, and celebrating that. At the same time, there are signs all around the falls saying, don't you dare try and go down. You'll be shot on sight if you try and do it. So it's the same kind of idea somehow.
That's a lovely analogy. I really, really like that.
Yeah.
Well, bon appetit. Enjoy your dinner.
I will. But anyway, good to join you both, and I'm really glad that the book's doing well, as it deserves to. It's been a labour of love.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks again for a great introduction, all your work on the book. So, where have we got to? Nice to see Dr. Nick's checking up on what we're saying. It feels when we get the historians in, we're going to get some adults talking about this, because we're very much, well, I speak for myself and Dave, we're very much enthusiastic amateurs, and so we're really looking forward to getting that historical framework and context and rigour, and along with Dr. Nick, we'll have Professor Neil Mackenzie. So where have we got to? Should we just wrap up with a few other, just for the fun of it, just things we loved about the book, or you loved about the book? Glenougie, again, we last looked at Strathclyde. There we go. There seem to be animals at so many of these distilleries, and they are actively working. There are stables and cows and all sorts.
Glenougie is great because it's one of the few where you actually get a glimpse into who the writer or writers even may have been. I mean, everything was published anonymously. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know even if it was just one writer. It looks like, I mean, if I was to put a bet on it, I'd say probably one writer did the lion's share of it, and maybe some of the articles at the end might have been written by someone else, actually. There's a couple of things later on where they talk about their correspondence and so on. But the Glenougie one's quite entertaining because he spends as much time talking about how good his lunch was, and how wonderful it was to wash it all down with 1895 Glenougie single malt, and then go and play a few rounds on the links, which is quite a nice insight into the people behind this. And actually, for some of these, I mean, the way he talks about this in particular, the tour of the distillery and talking about the distillery is really sandwiched between his breakfast and his dinner, which is a great insight.
That voice is very different. And it almost, to me, my interpretation of it was the editor of the magazine said, I'll take this one. I'll do this one. It's like David Riley Smith bags did that one and hopped on a train, and they even stand around and watch some locals for a while and just having fun. It seemed quite modern, that one. It was quite chimed with the modern drinks writer. Incidentally, one friend of the show seemed to think they might have a way of working out who the writers were, and is doing some research, but he refuses to commit because he said, I might make an ass of myself. So, but fingers crossed, we've got someone onto it. Actually, talking of detective work, some of the people are really interesting. Who's this guy? The brewer standing by at Fettercairn. Standing by to do what? To catch the killer?
Yeah. That's a great photo, that one. I mean, it really feels like something out of a film noir. Detective thing is absolutely great, and what a wonderful moustache he has. The guy at Ardbeg, I think, also has a great moustache as well. But yeah, there's some quite mysterious ones. There's another one which is a personal favourite at Glenmorangie, which is the team and their dog, which is as far as I've been able to find, the only dog in the book, but there may be others as well. No cats, as far as I could see. But yeah, really.
On the left, I'd never noticed. I didn't know. Oh no, he's standing behind. Sorry, he's standing behind a mulch shovel. I thought it was.
Yeah.
Sorry, he's standing behind a mulch shovel. Okay, fine. The 27 Men of Tame.
What's that right at the front?
A still, tiny still.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But that's not dawned on me until now.
Yeah, a great little still and a worm tub.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing, you know. The more you get into it, the more you discover these sort of little, you know, tidbits and things and the images that, because there's so much in there that you know, certain things hit you, and then you take another closer look, and it's like, oh wait a second, what about that?
The hat, that image, the hat. So there's you can see the managers. There's a hierarchy to the hat, or the owners, I should say, maybe. They've got their kind of trilby style. Then they've got the Peaky Blinders style. And then one guy, I ain't wearing no hat. Or I forgot my hat.
Yeah.
There's some great hats. And there's some jaunty styles to wearing them as well. Again, just one image. And sometimes very much, and other times, I don't know, there's something quite modern about this guy, and that's actually a really striking photograph, I thought. Who's that guy?
Remarkable way. Yeah,
and it's recent enough, you know, we could potentially work out who some of these people are, and you went to a great deal of effort to do an index of people as well, which I think will turn up some great nuggets, because people are mentioned a lot and people's careers are traced. They talk about who's the chap who comes down from Craigellachie to Hazelburn, and they talk about people who were respected as a brewer here going across to there. Of course, it's a trade journal, so they're talking about respected people within the industry. And I think we're going to maybe track down a few grandfathers or great-grandfathers of people.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, the James Eadie business was founded by someone wanting to revive their great-great-grandfather's company. So there's always been that sort of family history aspect to it. I mean, in some ways, James Eadie is the strangest episode of Who Do You Think You Are that's ever been made. And then, you know, when I was showing this to Alan Winchester and, you know, talking about the Hazelburn article, and he mentioned that Peter Innes in there is the grandfather of Alan Wolfenstone. And you know, a couple of months after I got my hands on, you know, the wonderful book that he and Ruth Hurd did on Takatsuru's notebook, and so seeing those links within the industry and how in many of these distilleries, you know, people have worked in distilleries for a long time, and they may well not be the first generation of their families to do that. I thought it was very important that you know, to be able to bring that kind of family history aspect in there as well. And actually, since you mentioned the Glen Moore picture, Jason Whisky Rover, who's been doing the Glen Moore project, he wrote a very interesting kind of deep dive on the Glen Moore distillery article from the book, and actually was having a stab at potentially identifying the people in the picture, and that would be, you know, if people can do that, then that would be absolutely wonderful. That'd be very good fun.
Yeah, and it's been, again, great to see people's reactions, and in many different ways. People who have a huge overview of the industry from a career working in it, or people who have this very narrow, and I don't mean that as a criticism, I mean that, you know, they love a certain distillery and have read huge amounts, anything they could about that individual distillery, to the point that they may even be the world expert on that individual distillery, such as Jason, because no one else had wanted to, and has done this amazing piece of work. The Glenougie guy on Glenougie, there's a Rosebank guy, Marcel Van Keel's at Lefroy, and there we know frantically unwrapping this book and turning to the page that their distillery is on and seeing what it has added to their knowledge, and that's been so great to see. And actually, it's worth saying, you and I have spoken for a long time of how do we unleash this tome onto the world, and we very much wanted to keep the general knowledge of it and the existence of it a secret as long as possible. And we wanted everyone to receive the book at the same time. We wanted no spoilers. We wanted the community to have that same amazing feeling of discovery, which is like, oh, how can this exist? This is so great that this exists. And I think I was delighted with how we worked on that and how we got that to happen, because the excitement's been just superb. You know, I'm just randomly going to put up Stronachy Distillery.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Look at it. What a beautiful distillery.
I mean, Stronachy might be the weirdest one in the whole thing, actually, because I think they, you know, in the 2 or 3 pages on that distillery, you have they malted the barley at the train station. Then they had a narrow gauge railway, which took it half the way to the distillery. Then they stuck it on a truck to bring it to the distillery. And the location of the distillery was chosen because I think it was near the owner's country estate. And it was incredibly remote. It closed a couple of years after this profile.
I might have had to close. It sounded pretty inefficient to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it was effectively, by the sounds of it, it was the owner's sort of vanity project. I mean, what a wonderful vanity project to have.
Yeah, there might be a few of those built at the moment. But I hope we survive. It's different times. And we're probably, where are we? 9:15? I mean, it's going to be a wellspring of information. And we're only just starting to get the feedback from everybody and do our own research and look at it. But I mean, you started to put some great stuff together in terms of output of distilleries, estimated annual output based on the information that they do put in the book there. And so these are the small distilleries up to 500,000 litres of alcohol estimated per year. The green are still active today. The red have closed. So that's it. Okay, the very smallest ones down at the end there that I mentioned, they closed. But otherwise, it's a fairly even spread. There's no particular pattern there. But then once you look at the larger distilleries, something a bit more happening there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Actually, some of the larger ones mentioned have shut, which I suppose should be a huge surprise, but was interesting nonetheless. And we just use all this data. Now, okay, again, the accuracy of it could be questioned, sure. And it's incomplete. They don't mention the output and the input, actually, of the bushels of barley for all distilleries. But we can put it into graphs and play around with it, can't we? We can have a bit of fun. Weekly output relative to efficiency. Do you want to explain that one, Leon?
Yeah, I mean, like you were saying, I mean, with something like this, yes, you can question the accuracy of some of the figures that were given. I mean, the big outlier there is Bruichladdich, which apparently was, you know, the most efficient distillery by a country mile. And a level of efficiency that no other distillery could have ever come close to, which is quite interesting considering I think they talk quite a lot about the use of horses at Bruichladdich at the time. So you sort of wonder whether there was maybe a typo with a couple of the numbers, but actually most of them are pretty bang on the money. And you know what's quite interesting to see here, I mean, when you look at the efficiency, how many proof gallons they were getting out of the bushels, you know, there you can see there isn't really any correlation between the distilleries that were producing lots of whiskey and the distilleries that were producing much less. I mean, some of the Campbelltown ones, for example, are much more efficient than, you know, Mortlach, Darien, and I think Glenlivet is the least efficient distillery of the lot, which
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure has changed. So it's more about being able to pull out a sort of general picture and see what's there. But for me, it was quite striking that the big distilleries, you know, the ones that were producing a lot 100 years ago, are broadly the big, well, not the big, but certainly the ones that are around today. And what was also interesting is how some of the Islay distilleries are, well, some of the biggest producers of malt whiskey, which certainly isn't the case now. So,
Although,
yeah, there's...
if you look at the regional output, I mean, Grain's not a region, but of the distilleries mentioned in the book where capacity is mentioned, so this is a pretty partial graph, but still, Ireland and Grain, boof.
Yeah.
big amounts of liquid, and of course, the age of the single malt is going to take a little bit of a back seat for a while after this period. So I think we've probably left a little bit in the chamber for our future discussions. I mean, we've covered maybe, 20 or so photographs, 25 photographs of the 650 or so in this book. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Leon, or do you think you've fairly covered that?
Well, I mean, the other thing I wanted to say actually is, for me, one of the most enjoyable parts of the whole book was Tom's endnotes. Actually, the paragraphs on each of the distilleries, because it's a great idea of his, and it's a very very satisfying way of ending the book. You know, the natural question when you reach all of these is what happened next. For some of the names, we know what happened next. For others, you know, like you mentioned, that sort of went down in a blaze of glory in a fight with a local tennis club, or, you know, other such things. The story is a bit more muddy, and there's stuff in there which is, you know, I certainly had never seen before, which I'm not sure are that well known, and I think is a really wonderful resource. I think Tom's done a really superb job on that. So the articles are, you know, fascinating, and there's so much information there that, you know, even, you know, you or I don't think has come close to processing. Just there's so much. But I also think some of the other things that come along with it, such as Tom's introduction, the endnotes and other things, just take it up to another level. And you know, there's really a lot of interesting stuff out there for people who are interested. So
yeah, it's going to take a while, I think, for a lot of people to come to terms with all this new information, and we hope that the next week or so on Liquid Antiquarian will be a kind of good start to that. I'm certainly valuing the input of the whisky community so far, and people just noticing little things that I had not noticed at all. But congratulations again. I have congratulated you many times before, but congratulations again. Thank you so much for a huge contribution to the whisky community. I will say goodbye now, I think. Leon, thank you again. And yeah, I hope you'll be able to tune in. I think you're on holiday next week, aren't you? But maybe you could tune in from the Black Forest or wherever you are.
Absolutely, from deepest, darkest Germany. Yeah, I will be tuning in. I'll be the first one there, and I can't wait to see what Nick and Niall and Alan and Robert and the other guests that you've got coming on have to say. It will be a real pleasure to hear what experts with a lot of knowledge are able to dig out of this, and I will be glued to my screen when they're live. So yeah, can't wait.
Yeah, great. Okay, cheers, Leon. So thank you very much for watching. It's great to be back. We have quite a number of things planned for Liquid Antiquarian. It's been a big break as the day job came back at Dave and I pretty hard, and traveling started again. And so we did have a big hiatus, but don't worry, we have been beavering away in the background. We've got lots of things that we want to talk about. So please do follow us, do all the things that people do on social media. Apparently it's really helpful. And we're going to have lots of really cool stuff for you this autumn. You know, cool in our world anyway, not cool compared to what normal people think. But anyway, thanks very much. Really good to be back. Bye.